everybody. Welcome back to another edition of Byline with Ben Dennis. I hope everyone had a really fantastic Thanksgiving holiday. I spent it in warm Florida as opposed to very cold in the 30s Washington, D.C., where I otherwise could have, or actually in Pennsylvania. Right on the Maryland border with my family where temperatures are not that different. However, hope you had some time off. It's starting to come down to the end of the year when certainly emails possibly are left unread. Are you in that category? I like to think that I'm not, especially in the news world. There's a lot to get to. And there's a lot to get to today as well. I have an interview about the headache for young people about home affordability. Is the dream of owning a house actually still alive in the United States? Is it attainable? It seems that many of us are renting. Doesn't seem like we're able to actually afford a home, not just in the Washington, D.C. market, where no doubt there is a high cost of living in addition to housing, but across the country too. People are facing an affordability crisis in many cases right now, but just home ownership specifically. And actually has this evolved. So my conversation is with a D.C. area, Northern Virginia, Metro Washington, D.C. realtor. Her name is Olivia Farrell. I go back with Olivia a couple of years ago. We have mutual contact. My fiance, Greg, she actually went to school with him in Columbia, Maryland. However, she is very insightful on all things realty and how folks in many different income brackets can achieve home ownership. She's making the case for it, finding different avenues to make that happen, including we're diving into this whole 50-year mortgage that the White House has thrown out as a possibility, essentially making a payment plan for half a century on a home. Is it a good idea? Is it a bad idea? Certainly a lot of unanswered questions. And of course, afterwards, I'm diving into the headlines without spin, no filler, no fluff, going beyond them to make sense of them. What is going on in the Caribbean right now with these boat strikes on what the Pentagon and the White House says are boats carrying drugs meant for killing Americans? Well, Pete Hegseth, the defense secretary, is increasingly in hot water, under pressure, especially from Democrats and longtime career diplomats, for his alleged role in ordering these strikes, specifically for one in September, where initial reporting had said that he ordered to kill everyone on those boats. Separately, I want to talk a little bit about the U.S. economy. Yeah, obviously, most Americans see the economy and the health of it as if they can afford day-to-day essentials, but there's a new jobs report out. Could it actually be somewhat misleading, considering jobs report numbers on a federal level were put on at least a different timetable during the federal government shutdown? We'll get into that, as well as a couple more different headlines that I think are prudent, including holiday shopping. Is that going to be changing this year? And ICE in Minnesota, immigration enforcement going after Somalis who are under the president's microscope right now. He had called Ilhan Omar, the congressional representative from Somalia who lives there in Minneapolis, which has many Somali families there, called her garbage, and had said that he didn't want any Somalis in the United States. We'll dive in on that and some of my reporting as well. So with that in mind, let's dive into my conversation with Olivia. Joining me now is Olivia Farrell. She is a real estate agent in Northern Virginia. She's the owner and principal of Olivia Properties, bearing her own name, at Compass, which is a residential real estate firm. Olivia, you and I, disclaimer here, we go back several years. You grew up with my fiance, Greg, in Maryland, the suburbs of D.C., and I've certainly followed your career. I went to your wedding. We had a great time on the dance floor, but I thought that you would be a perfect source to dive in on this topic about home ownership because, you know, I cover a lot of politics, business, real day issues when I'm out on the streets in D.C. and elsewhere, but also on this podcast on Byline. And home ownership is something that can play into politics. It's certainly something that would guide somebody's decision. Finances is certainly a top of mind for folks. So I thought that you would be a great person to chime in on this topic. So thank you for joining Byline.
Thank you for having me. I feel so
Of
honored.
course.
I appreciate it.
Please. I'm honored to have you. Okay, the first question I have, and I'll be blunt. The dream of home ownership, is it dead? And how has it changed radically since, let's say, the 50s, coming out of World War II when vets were buying homes, starting families in brand new neighborhoods? What's the shift been?
I don't think it's dead, but I think it's changed. Well, it's definitely changed. I think the perception and the importance to people has shifted. So to your point, post-war, that was the number one thing. Everyone was you buy a house, you have a family, you live in that house for 50 plus years. I don't know how your grandparents were. My grandparents lived in the same house for ever, 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 ever.
For sure. Yep,
Right.
up until they
So,
died when they were in their 80s.
yeah, and I think that part of it has shifted. It depends on who you talk to. Some of the younger generations, homeownership is important to millennials, probably because their parents are the boomers, right? So that got instilled in them. Gen X rolled in, or maybe people in their late 20s, and they're like, I don't ever want to own a home. I'm going to rent. I'm going to invest my money elsewhere. I'm going to look at crypto or whatever. And now this new wave of kind of post college, I would say, early 20s, so a little bit younger. I feel like they're back to kind of being like, no, we want to buy something right now. We want to start our real estate portfolio right now. So, and that's just anecdotal, at least in my own experience. But no, to answer your question, I don't think it's dead at all. I think it just has shifted. I think it looks different for different people. I think there's different reasons why people buy real estate now. Sometimes it's more from an investment perspective. Sometimes it's because that's still the American dream and that's what they want. So I just think it's changed in that way.
What do you think some of the biggest factors have been over the last couple of decades?
Well, I think cost of real estate, even though so people forget, you have to remember it's still, everyone looks at real estate like when my parents bought their first home back in the late 80s, sales prices and home prices were significantly less than they are now, but people made less money too. So it's all relative, but I do think especially today, 2025, we're talking December 2025 right now. I mean, just the cost of everything is so much higher than it used to be. So I think that's a huge factor. Every market is a little bit different where we are, in most major cities, major metro areas, it's a high cost of living and it's hard. It's hard to save. It's hard to have the down payment. If you try to do it on your own, it's difficult. So I think that's part of it too. And then again, I just think the shift of it's really probably also the access to information and just knowing more and data and what's important from like an investment perspective. I just think the shift, the mentality of owning a home has changed for some people.
And to your point, you talked a little bit about the tips and tricks that you wish people would know, having access to certain information. I want to get into that. But the next thing I want to throw toward you is what is a realistic first time or what does a realistic first home look like today if you are sticking with that age old American idea of actually having a backyard, a white picket fence? What does a realistic one look like today?
I actually love this question because it really depends on what is important to the buyer. And I don't think enough people get to the root of that. I think agents sometimes, and just in conversation, like with your friends and family, and, everyone thinks they need to have whatever this American dream vision is, right? But it looks different for different people. Some people are perfectly content and they want, a two-bedroom condo in the city for their whole life. They don't want the fence. They don't want the yard. They don't want to deal with that. So I always go back to the individual. What do you want? Now, to piggyback on that, you have to be realistic also with what can you afford and where you are in your life, right? So if we're talking first-time buyers, typically, I would say, again, anecdotally, in my experience, it's mostly condos, townhouses, etc. You start with more of the starter home and then you build up from there. Which, by the way, I don't know why people have such a, and I'm not saying everyone does, but there's no shame around that. You should do that. Having an asset will give you leverage later, at least in most cases, and in my opinion. So I would say that that's probably the more norm is to start with your condo, start with a townhouse, something a little bit smaller, and then you can build on that, at least in my experience or most of my clients' experiences.
So once you're sitting in front of a couple different properties, or you're with a real estate agent, you found somebody that you really connect with, which I know you and I have talked about before. You want to find someone who can really get who you are and understand your goals. The follow-up I have here is, you know, better to have a lower interest rate or better to have a lower home price first time around?
$1,000,000 question. They kind of go hand in hand. So, what I will say to that is let's focus on the monthly payment versus the individual items that make up that monthly payment. And yes, it all goes into that monthly payment, right? So, the lower your interest rate, the more you're going to be able to afford, the further you can stretch your dollar. But sales price, typically what you see is when interest rates are lower, competition is higher, which means sales prices are higher. So you never want to try to time the market. It's not going to work. I'm telling you, like it's just it's very, very difficult to do that. Some people will get lucky and they will time it at the right time. What I would tell buyers, especially first-time buyers, is focus on what is your goal? Is your goal that you wanna own a property? Is your goal that you're buying an investment property? Is your goal that you wanna be your monthly payment under X amount? What is that goal? And then we'll break it down from there. But I think trying to time it and say, "I'm not gonna buy anything until rates are back to 5.5%." Well, sales prices might be 10% higher at that point. So it's sort of a moot point. So focus on the monthly payment, focus on your cash to close, so what you need for your all-in down payment plus closing costs. Focus on your monthly payment and what is comfortable for you as the buyer. That is the most important thing. Can you live with this monthly payment? Do you feel good about it? Do you love where you live? And is it helping you achieve your ultimate goal? If you check the majority of those boxes and you say yes, I think you're going to be pretty happy.
So before you even get to the monthly payment scenario, you probably are considering how much you want to put down. What's a healthy figure here?
So going back to our parents and like the boomer generation, and even like our grandparents, I think there's a common misconception that you need to have 20%, which is interesting that that's still the case. I talk to so many buyers that are like, well, we don't have 20%. Having having 20% or more eliminates mortgage insurance. It's called PMI, right? Which goes towards your monthly payment, and it's a fee basically, or it's an additional cost in your monthly payment that you can avoid. The downside to that is you might have to wait years to have 20% down payment. I mean, it depends where you are and it depends on the sales price you're looking at, but 20% is a lot. So to answer your question, we write contracts all day long, 5-10% down, especially for our first-time buyers. Now, look, the more you can put down from a monthly perspective, is your monthly payment going to be lower? Yes. But what I tell people is if waiting and waiting to save, like, let's say you could do 5% today and you can afford that monthly payment, right? So it goes back to the comfort level and you're okay with that payment versus waiting and saving for a year, 2 years, 3 years, that sales price is not going to be the same in a couple years. So you have to factor in the cost of waiting too and saving. 5% is typically the lowest. There are programs. Every state has different programs. Some you can do as little as 3.5% down. That's more on like the lender side. They can help you with some of that, kind of figuring out where you fall. But I would typically say 5% is the minimum. And then anything above that is really up to the buyers. The other thing people should know too, from a cash to close perspective, is it's your down payment plus closing costs. So you need enough cash in the bank that you have your down payment, but also closing. Closing costs will depend on your state, location, etc. I can speak to the DMV where I'm located. DC metro area is typically about 2.5 to 3% for closing costs. So if you go back to the math, if you have 5% down, you really probably need 8% or so of the sales price total cash all in.
For somebody who's coming into this conversation considering buying a home dry with little to no information, really, what does the closing cost even go toward? You got your down payment, you've got your monthly payment in focus. What's the purpose of closing costs for someone who's just diving into this?
Closing costs will encompass your transfer taxes, your lender fees, your title fees. Some states call them escrow agents. So again, it kind of depends on where you are, but it's all the fees that make up, we call them the transaction fees, if you will. And then your down payment is your down payment. So that goes towards your loan, and that is what it is. Whether you choose 5%, 10%, whatever makes the most sense, with your discussions with your lenders.
Down payments are not going to go toward the closing fees.
No, it's two separate buckets. That's really important for people to understand, and it makes up your total cash to close. But a lot of people don't know that. So they come to me and they say, Olivia, okay, we have 5%, we're ready to go. And I'm like, well, you really need
You really have three, right?
well, it depends how you look at it. Right. You either have 3 or you need 8. Depends how you want to do your math.
Sure. Unknown fees. Speaking of HOA, talk about what other things you should prepare for. Property taxes, they're going to come around every single year. What are the unknowns and some of the possible unpredictable variables?
I mean, that's hard for me to give a finite list, right? HOA fees are a big sticking point for some people.
Especially in the suburbs, right? You could live out in farm country, you can avoid it completely.
Some people are like, I do not want an HOA. I don't want a condo. They want nothing to do with it. Sometimes it could be a good thing, though, because you have to remember, if there's an HOA or there's a condo, your next door neighbor can't necessarily do all the crazy things that maybe they want to do. So there's pros and cons to everything. From a fee perspective, I always tell people HOA and condo fees typically will go up every single year. Is there an exact percentage? No. Hopefully it's a reasonable, basically with cost of living to go up. Something I would tell you is, so by law, most states are like this. Again, my expertise is in the DC metro area. The seller has to provide the buyer the condo docs or the HOA docs while you're under contract. Something that is really important, if you are a buyer purchasing in an HOA or a condo community, ask if it's not provided for you, what have been the fees? What were the fees last year? What were the fees the year before? Is there any? Do you have any special assessments coming up? Is there anything? Try to get as much information as you can. But at least if you have a ballpark of like, okay, look, maybe they go up 4 or 5% each year, so you kind of can project that. Now, obviously, there's no crystal ball, right? You just have to know that if you're going into it, that they're likely going to go up. Your taxes will likely go up in many scenarios. In terms of unknown fees, though,
Before we get that, I want to ask you about HOA. You talk about transparency, trying to get almost like an audit of your community of what other people have been paying, what you might expect to pay. Have you ever come across a scenario where an HOA fee was negotiable?
no,
You're stuck in
not,
stone at that point.
yeah, no. I've never had that. I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but no. It's because it's what happens with the HOA and the condo fee is it's voted on and decided on by the board or the management company or whomever to run and maintain the community. More often than not, it goes up every year. And that doesn't mean by like crazy amounts, but people need to understand that. Think about it. If the cost of living goes up, if the maintenance people, if everything costs more, obviously there needs to be that account needs to be funded, right? Or what ends up happening is then you have a special assessment. What a special assessment means for people who don't know is it depends on how the HOA and condo community assesses it. But usually they say, hey, every single homeowner in this community owes us X amount flat rate next year or in the next 2 years. And you really don't have a choice. You live there. You chose to live there and you have to pay that. So having it increase nominally each year is usually better for the community, but no, I've never seen it be negotiable. I mean, sometimes people have payment plans. So some communities will say you can go on a payment plan, or it really just depends. I know that's such a vague answer, but it really depends on how the community is
It's case
run.
specific of how the board sets up the fee structure and the fee process. How about tips and tricks for finding a good inspector to come in before you purchase a home? You want to find the right person, so A, you're not getting stiff with the cost of the inspection itself, but that every nook and cranny is covered.
You get what you pay for. That is my number one tip. You get what you pay for in an inspector. Hopefully your agent, this kind of goes back to, we touched on this really briefly at the beginning of this conversation. Having an excellent team in place is so key. The tough part about that is, especially if you've never done it before, you don't really know what you don't know, right? You don't know what a good team looks like. Having an exceptional agent who has those resources, but can also say, my past 50, 100, 150, 250 clients have used the same company, and you can talk to any of them and they'll give you raving reviews. That's really important to understand. Um, but you get what you pay for. Do not, this is just my personal experience, my client's experience. If you're going to go with the cheapest inspector, you're probably going to get the cheapest results.
Mm. And then the most expensive repercussions.
Exactly. Now, what I will say in the inspector's defense is they can't cut open your walls, right? They can look at everything, but to a limited degree. So when you're purchasing a home, you need to understand that you're going to move in and you're going to always find something, right? Or something will happen over time. That is part of home ownership, right? Eventually, you might need to change out an outlet, or you might have a faucet leak or something. The goal with the inspection is to make sure that everything is solid and there's not something really massive or really something you're uncomfortable with as the buyer. It goes back to comfort levels, right? You need to feel good about it, but you also have to be realistic too. So I will say that in the inspector's defense that, you know, hopefully they can see the majority of everything. But of course, there's limitations, just like everything else.
I'm an alliterative guy. Myth versus math. Let's dive into that. If you are looking at buying a home that's a fixer-upper or it doesn't need much renovation at all, we saw the costs of materials to build homes, to renovate homes, certainly go up during COVID, post-COVID. I'm curious to get your take and a pulse on how that has fared in at least the last couple of months. Is it better to possibly go for a fixer-upper? Is it cheaper long-term, or are those renovation costs going to be a bad sticking point?
It all depends on what is important to you as the homeowner.
This is a reoccurring theme.
I know. That could
It's
be
a
the
very
tag.
diplomatic answer, by the way.
Well, I'll tell you, I'll go into detail. I know that could be our tagline of this episode. What does it mean to you? But it's true. There's a couple of variables to it. Okay, do I think, going back to kind of what you were saying earlier, typically can you get a better deal on fixer-uppers or things that need work? Yes. Okay, so that's, if you want to look at it from that perspective, I think there's a lot of opportunity for buyers who are willing to do some work. So many people want move-in ready, they want turnkey, they don't want to do anything, and they're willing to pay a premium for that.
Mhm.
So, if you're willing to do some work, I absolutely think there are opportunities out there, especially right now, even, just in the month we're in, going into kind of some of the slower times, etc. I definitely think there's opportunities.
And you're talking about cost savings, creativity aside.
I'm talking about cost savings in the sense of sales price, purchase price, because the caveat to this is you have to have the cash to do the renovations if that's what you ultimately want, right? So, like, if you want the sweat equity, you're going to have to fund the projects that you want to get done outside of your mortgage. So what happened, like, take COVID, for example, when interest rates were really low because it was so cheap to borrow money. People are like, well, we don't want to spend, you know, 50 grand to do our kitchen but taking it out of our bank account to do it ourselves. We'll just go purchase a house that's $50,000, $75,000 more in the purchase price, because that goes back to your monthly payment. Don't forget, that's not cash out of pocket. And they didn't care because rates were lower, right? Money was cheaper to borrow. That has shifted a little bit now that money is a little bit more expensive to borrow. So you have to have the cash to do the projects if you care about doing the renovations down the road. From a sweat equity perspective, from a resale perspective, the more A plus a property is on the resale side, typically the better off you're going to be. So if you want to purchase a fixer upper, I would say the the more successful approach is gonna be purchase the fixer-upper and then do the projects, and then hopefully you'll benefit on the resale side
And
versus
that takes well, that couple points that you have already mentioned here. Obviously, you wanna think long term, first time home buyer, you should probably be thinking about when you sell as well, if you're looking to
totally.
upgrade, right?
Yes, and that's a really important figure, and you don't always have to have it figured out, but there are different purchase mentalities for, if you say, "Okay, I'm probably only gonna be in this house for 3, 4, 5 years," that's a much different purchase than, "I wanna be in this house for 20 years." And it doesn't always work out that way. Sometimes you end up in a place longer than you thought. Sometimes you end up moving before you thought, right?
Depending on the market, exactly.
Well, depending on the market, jobs, I mean, so many family things, there's so many things that happen. The other thing, by the way, is sometimes people will come to me and say, "Olivia, I really wanna buy, but I'm probably gonna leave the area." We live in a very transient area. I'm probably gonna leave the area within 2 years. Sometimes it doesn't make sense to buy unless having that investment is important to you, right? So it goes back to the original goal. Is having an investment property important to you in your portfolio? If the answer is no, maybe you shouldn't buy, and that's okay too. So, yes, you are hit the nail on the head that thinking about kind of that timeline, especially when it comes to renovations, are you going to be in it long enough, or is it worth it enough to you, or you see the ROI, the potential to do the renovations? Sometimes the answer to that is no.
What's the most common mortgage term that you come across for first-time home buyers? And I'm gonna dip into this whole idea of a 50-year mortgage too. But, at least the most common term, if you will, is it 15 or 30? What are we looking at?
You mean like loan product type? I would say the most common is a 30-year fixed. That's probably the majority of loans. I'd actually be curious to know the answer to that because COVID really there were a lot of the last couple of years there have been some creative products and things that have been done. But 30-year fixed is the most common and it's probably the most familiar to everyone. And what that means is you have a 30-year mortgage and fixed means it's exact same every single month. Now,
Interest rates.
your rate is the same every month, correct, unless you refinance. Don't forget, though, if your taxes go up, and this is assuming your lender is paying your taxes, which is very common. Well, if you have a loan, they will pay your taxes. If your taxes go up, then your monthly might be adjusted slightly. Sometimes they go down. Every once in a while, your taxes go down. Not very often. But if you go
Not
steady,
nearly as often as any of us would like,
no,
correct.
no, no. But yes, 30-year fixed is the most common, I would say.
An uncommon option these days is what the White House is putting out there, and that's a possibility of a 50-year mortgage, possibly lowering your payments, but obviously you're on the hook for a longer term. Is this really a healthy idea? What are the pros and cons here? A lot of skeptics on this issue.
Very controversial. I will preface this by saying I definitely haven't heard enough about it to make, you know, really I'll just kind of give my initial thoughts, right? Let's see what actually happens. Let's see what the details actually are. Who knows? Maybe 50 years will be the norm. I don't know. The important piece to understand is what actually does your mortgage look like and what goes into it and what does it mean? The beginning of any mortgage, whether it's 15, 30-year, 50-year, is mostly interest. Okay? So that is the key, right? So you need
Well,
to
that probably scares some people that they're not paying down on the principal, right? So why is that the case?
it's think about how a bank works. They got to get their money back, right? They're loaning you all this money and they're saying, "Yeah, but we need to get paid back. We need to make sure it's worth it for us to loan you the money up front." But the reason I bring that up is because it goes back to your point about how long are you going to own the property, right? So I don't know if the 50-year is going to come to light. I do think it would allow more affordability, which is a good thing. So if it allows you to have a lower monthly payment because you can stretch it out for longer and then people can achieve the goal of homeownership. I mean, ultimately, do I think that's, in concept, a great thing? Yes. But in practice, we'll have to kind of see how it shakes out. I don't really
To
know. I
me,
don't know if it's a good idea or
it's
bad idea.
to me, it also sounds like the market's going to be so much more competitive if people feel like that they can go in and buy a home, far sooner than they thought otherwise, right? If you have more people who are writing, or at least signing mortgage contracts, then it's probably going to be more difficult in some scenarios to actually buy that home.
I would agree with that. I think competition drives so much of this. That's the other storyline or thing to look at for next year too, for 2026, is there are so many people sitting on the fence waiting for rates to come down, especially those that bought during COVID, right? They're sitting on 2.5, 3% interest rates, which is, we'll probably never see those again, or at least not for a really long time, right? So these people are waiting and they're saying, "Okay, maybe if rates were like 5%, we'd make the jump. We'd buy something else, we'd sell what we're currently in, but we weren't gonna do it for 7 or 8%." So you have, to your point, this backlog of, or this, just jam of people that are kinda waiting it out to see if rates go down, and then they're gonna jump back in. And now if you add something of, a 50-year mortgage, or even just rates going down in general, new buyers are going to come into that pool too. So, I hate to say this, but I think there's this misconception, at least again, I can only speak to my market, or kind of major metro areas typically are similar for the most part. There's some major cities right now that are very different, but in general, I don't really foresee prices coming down drastically anytime soon. Yeah, it's a matter of, like, how do we figure out how to make things affordable? Affordable is such a, I don't even know how to define that word anymore, because it's so different to everyone else, and it's just such a, I feel like it gets tossed around so much, and it's just so, I don't know, this is a topic for another day, but I
That's
just,
fine, but let's go back to your point. You said you don't think the costs are gonna come down drastically. Make the case for someone who is waiting right now.
well, again, I can only speak to kind of my immediate market, right? But if you look at that, and you take that data, there is so much pent up demand, and the inventory is not keeping up with that demand. And that has been the case for years. We are years behind. So, what happened in '08 during the crash, a lot of builders and new construction said no, and they paused, and they didn't build anything for several years. Then things started getting good again. So you have that, right? So you have actual new physical new properties that didn't get built for a couple years. Okay, so now we're behind on that. Then fast forward, rates started coming down, the economy started stabilizing. Then you had COVID and rates plummeted and things went bonkers, right? So now you have all of that in the mix. And I just think, well, I know you can take it from, we get stats all the time from NAR's chief economist, or people who study this data who are much, much more entrenched in the data than
NAR,
I.
National Association of Realtors?
That's right. Yes. They're much more entrenched in the data than I am, that the inventories is years behind demand. And so when rates get lower again, buying power gets higher, maybe the 50-year mortgage comes out, like you said, affordability, or this, it really comes down to purchase power, buying power becomes more available. Now you have more people.
Competition skyrockets. It's like 10 dogs vying for one bone.
That's right. And everyone wants the same thing. You have to be solutions oriented. You have to have a plan, but you also have to be realistic. Just because you can doesn't mean you should. I say this to buyers all the time. You need to make sure you are comfortable with the purchase, with the monthly payment, and that you're going to be good to go. And it doesn't mean you don't have to stretch. It doesn't mean sometimes you don't have to make sacrifices on your wish list, right? But you still have to feel good about it at the end of the day. I always tell my clients that. I'm like, you need to love where you live. It is the most expensive purchase you'll ever make of anything in your lifetime.
I'm gonna get you out on this. You're a busy woman. Either you personally or from your experience talking with your colleagues, what do realtors wish that first-time home buyers knew at the gate up front?
I wish they knew that assets give you leverage ultimately. And I say that because starting small or figuring out a way to have real estate in your investment portfolio, and this is just my opinion. I am not a financial advisor. This is just how I feel and based on my experiences and my clients' experiences that owning an asset 9 times out of 10 will hopefully give you leverage in the future. And so going back to one of your first questions, how can some of these first-time buyers figure it out? Is there anything that they can do, or what are some of like the tips and tricks? So a lot of people now will do something called house hacking. They'll purchase a condo or townhouse and they'll rent out a room, for example, or get a roommate, and they'll have someone essentially help them with their mortgage, right? So that's a great way to do that, but they own the asset. And I just think it's hard to think about that I wish I had bought a place when I was a lot younger than when I did. Average first-time home buyer, by the way, they just released this statistic the other day, is getting closer and closer to 40. Average first-time home buyer nationally, 40 years old.
Wow.
So if there's a way that you can figure out how to purchase something when you're younger, 20s, 30s, and a
Possible group purchase?
group purchase. Now, I will tell you, if you do a group purchase, my advice to you would be speak with an attorney, have everything figured out, have everything nice, clear, concise, ironed out because you don't want any issues later on. But assets give you leverage, in my experience and in my opinion. And I think, you know, if you look at anyone who's super wealthy or who has done well in life, real estate is in almost all of their portfolios. I'm not saying it's the right answer for everyone. I'm not saying, it has to make sense for you. You have to be able to afford it. You have to be able that it has to be important to you. But if you just look at the overall picture, typically it's included.
Okay, so you talk about having assets, that this is going to be integral for you long term. Say maybe you do not have the cash right now to afford a home to live in right now, but you might be able to afford something that you rent out, have passive income that can help you buy your first home. What do you think about that?
I love it. And I also sometimes think outside the box. Maybe you don't necessarily purchase where you live either. Maybe it's you go in all together and you buy an investment property in a different state or a different location. I think that's a great way to do things too. So it doesn't always have to be home ownership doesn't always have to look like this, what we think it's supposed to look like, right? Maybe you want to rent where you live or it makes more sense financially to rent where you live. But yeah, owning something with a group of people in a different area or even in your own area too, like I was saying earlier, obviously make sure you have everything ironed out and, very crystal clear on paper. I think it's a great way to do that. Now, obviously, if you own something in an area you don't live, there's things that go with that, along with that, property management, there's a couple more logistics.
Social headaches as well, dealing with tenants if there's a problem
Yes.
that arises.
I
Yeah.
mean, yeah. So there's a couple things that you have to kind of figure out, but I think it's a great idea. And you still own real estate is still in your portfolio. You still own real estate. I love it. I'm just a believer in, obviously, I believe in real estate and I believe in, investing and in multiple things too and diversifying. And if that's a way for you to achieve the goal of owning something and, you feel comfortable with it and it makes financial sense for you, I'm all in.
Thank you for giving us a picture into your world, Olivia Farrell. I appreciate your time joining Byline. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
All right, let's go in deeper to the headlines as we do. What is going on at the Pentagon with these strikes on boats in the Caribbean? Defense Secretary, War Secretary Pete Hegseth, whatever you want to call him, he says that these are on alleged narco terrorists. Drug boats smuggling drugs into the United States. The initial argument was that fentanyl was being brought into the United States, and all of this, as we know, off the coast of Venezuela. So a lot of back and forth whether what we're doing right there in the Caribbean is actually to oust Nicolas Maduro, who's widely considered as a dictator after he, as many accounts say, he lost the election to the Venezuelan opposition leader. However, These strikes continue to be in the headlines. Why? Because the question surrounds where the buck stops. Does it stop with Pete Hegseth? Pete Hegseth had reportedly, according to the Washington Post, ordered a quote, kill all order for a strike that happened back in September, where the United States fired ammunition. And apparently there were survivors who did not get killed during that first round. Well, there was a second round where Hegseth came out and denied an initial report from the Washington Post saying that he issued a kill all order. Now, the admiral, his name is Admiral Bradley, came out to Congress this past week and told them essentially what he was ordered and what he had witnessed and experienced via video when these strikes had been happening. Well, the initial reports were that Bradley said that there was not a kill all order for these strikes, for this specific strike, rather. And then it was NBC News that came out in the last couple of days who reported that Bradley was working on orders based on what Pete Hegseth had ordered, and it was the fact that there were 11 people on this boat, the alleged fact that there were 11 people on this boat that were on a list where essentially, if given the opportunity, American military forces could kill people. I have some questions about whether we have had these certain types of lists before, whether they also involve people who possibly might not provide an immediate imminent threat. If, say, this boat was bombed and there were survivors, are the people that are clinging to the boat actually an immediate threat? Republican Senator Tom Cotton had signaled that possibly these survivors were using a radio device to talk to other alleged drug smugglers, or at least another vessel that was nearby, to come save them. Who knows what was actually happening? We have not seen the video of what had happened during that strike, and at least after that strike, when those two survivors apparently were clinging to life. So there's certainly going to be more questions for the Department of Defense, for Pete Hegseth, for Admiral Bradley, for the White House, as well as who ordered what information they had at the time, as well as why they thought they had the authority to go ahead and strike these boats. I had a previous conversation with a professor of law at Georgetown University. His name is Todd Huntley. Great conversation about these strikes, whether they're legal or not. He had said at the time here on Byline that he didn't think that they were. He provided legal counsel at the Pentagon to top military officials before they did strikes, before they carried out military orders, and considered if the evidence that they had at the time would basically qualify a strike as being legal or illegal. He said there were some cases where there wasn't enough evidence that he thought that would constitute a legal strike, and other times the contrary. That's a conversation I suggest you go check that out. Again, we'll see what's reporting comes out of the Pentagon, especially with reporters from legacy organizations who decided not to abide by these new rules, if you will, that the Pentagon imposed on the press. That story's not going away. Jobs report. Does it tell us anything that's substantial? Well, yes, especially if the Fed is going to consider to lower interest rates. They've been dropping them incrementally throughout the year. The cost of living, we know, is high. People might not be borrowing as much money right now as a result of that. However, there's a new job report out, and it says that private employers in the United States shed 32,000 jobs in November, which was apparently not according to the forecast from economists. They had suggested some modest gains, but we saw a slight loss. Here's why this matters. This was the biggest drop since early of 2023. Joe Biden was president at the time, and reportedly driven by some small businesses. I'm reading some of my notes here as those who are watching this. I'm looking away from the camera. I'm suggesting some possible fragility among smaller employers. Here's the question. Is this just a blip in the payroll? And yeah, back to those interest rates. How might this ultimately influence the Fed's decision to possibly cut interest rates further toward the end of the year into 2026? Who knows if Fed Chair Jerome Powell is going to have a job tomorrow? Who knows if he was going to have a job yesterday? As of what we knew from President Trump a couple of weeks ago, Jerome Powell has faced the ire of President Trump. He is namely talked about a project that the president says has been over budget to renovate the Fed building itself. That story aside, we'll have to keep an eye to see how interest rates might change throughout the rest of the year. Federal immigration officers continue to work in all areas of the country. Initially, the president had targeted Democratic majority electorate cities: Los Angeles, Chicago, New York City, Washington, D.C., where he sent in the National Guard. Well, he's now sending ICE into Minnesota. Minneapolis leaders are out on the record saying that they're going to protect immigrant communities. Minneapolis is a hub of where Somali immigrants, people who are American citizens, Ilhan Omar, congressional representative, she's from Somalia herself, had said some 95% of people who are living in Minnesota are from Somalia are United States citizens. 95%, 5% are not. President had shared some disparaging remarks about them this week at the White House, called Omar garbage, but also said he does not, frankly, want Somalis in this country. He says that they complain, they don't contribute. So, what's the allegation here? The president claims that Somalis in Minnesota are stealing billions of dollars with a B every single year, and it's taxpayer money, sending it to Al Qaeda backed groups, allegedly taxpayer money that came through COVID-era programs. The Associated Press this week had reported that there has not been any substantial proof that this was happening. The Treasury announced lately that they have launched an investigation into alleged misuse and funneling of taxpayer money by Somalis in Minnesota. Keep an eye on that investigation, but the president certainly going after Somalis because of the investigation. And in this cabinet meeting, he shared these disparaging remarks. I talked with a man who lives in Northern Virginia in my normal day-to-day local news reporting, and he says he moved to the United States since 1982. He became emotional in my conversation about this, and he was very frank about what he thought about the president's remarks. I'll preface this also by saying that he says that he's been voting for Republicans. He's unapologetically conservative. Says that he voted for both Bush presidents. He's been taking issue with President Trump ever since he started running for president back in 2015. 10 years of Donald Trump certainly taking hold and flipping the American political sphere on its head. However, he is not happy with what the president had said. He questioned why President Trump would be targeting Somalis. He says, your wife is an immigrant. Why are you targeting immigrants? He says that he has been contributing as a cab driver to the D.C. area for 40 years, and President Trump's comments that Somalis don't contribute anything are contrary to his own personal experience. Holiday shopping. Are you going to be spending the way you normally do? May you spend a little bit less this year? May you spend more? The National Retail Federation in a recent report had signaled that it seems a lot of people will be spending handedly this year, close to $1,000 for presents, whether it be food, travel, you name it, the whole bundle. Wrap it in a bow. Why not? Well, I'm just curious to see if the affordability concerns that President Trump says are a Democrat hoax, the idea of affordability is a hoax, will actually alter people's spending habits. We're getting closer toward December the 25th. Have you already made your list and checked it twice? Are you naughty or nice? Have you knocked somebody off your own list who's been naughty? Have you put somebody on who's been nice? Anyway, Santa Claus is coming to town, and folks will certainly be spending online, increasingly so. Every single year, it seems like these online retailers are offering deals and deals earlier and earlier and earlier. Is that okay to start the Christmas season earlier? Is it okay to start playing Mariah Carey Christmas tunes earlier in the season? That's up to you. You have that own choice. So we'll keep an eye on consumer spending, indeed. Finally, out of tragedy, there is some good news. Those two National Guard members from West Virginia who were shot in D.C., reportedly ambush style in the head a day before Thanksgiving. One of them is showing improvement at the hospital. His name is Andrew Wolf. He is in his 20s. His family have reportedly told West Virginia Governor Patrick Morrisey that Andrew was starting to look more like himself. He's still in serious condition. His family had visited President Trump this week after an invite to the White House. The family of Sarah Beckstrom was also invited. She died not long after she was shot. Young specialists in the National Guard, they were on duty, patrolling D.C. streets as they have been doing for the last several months after the president had deployed the Guard from many different states into the nation's capital to beautify but also go after crime. Andrew is showing improvement. The estimation right now is he's got 2 to 3 more weeks in the hospital. Who knows what conditions he is in, and we only wish him the best and his family the best and only the most amount of peace that the Beckstroms can receive right now. It's incredibly tragic, especially around the holidays, and we hope that they're lifted up. Personally, I hope so as well. With that, I hope you have a great week ahead. I will be certainly sending out more booking interviews and looking for more topics to dive into to go behind the headlines, make sense of them without spin. That's the motto. We're not straying from it. I enjoy it. So why stop anything that you enjoy? I also think it's beneficial for all of us out there cutting through the noise. Thanks for your time, and we'll see you next week. Take it easy.